Speaking of stupid games, here's another one for you, Scott. On July 14th, the Center for Countering Disinformation, hell of a name, it's an adjunct to President Zelensky, published a list of 72 persons, including yourself, whom they claim are Russian propagandists. Now, since I have to ask you this, since you're an American citizen, you pay your taxes, your tax dollars are being used to pay the salaries of Ukrainian government employees. How does it feel to be paying a foreign government to censor you? How weird is that?
Well, it's go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, what say you to being labeled a Russian propagandist, for crying out loud?
Well, I mean, first of all, we can laugh about it because it's ridiculous. But what does that mean, Russian propagandist, in this day and age, where Russia has been vilified? If you are labeled a Russian propagandist, it has a chilling effect on your employability. I'm a freelance writer. I've had stuff published in every major newspaper in this country, every major outlet. No one can say that I'm fringe. I was mainstream.
Absolutely.
But nobody will touch me today because I'm a Russian propagandist. A Russian propagandist. Therefore, everything I write apparently is being dictated to me by Vladimir Putin himself. But it's worse than that, because on that July 14th meeting, these people said these people on the list aren't just Russian propagandists, they're information terrorists who should be arrested and prosecuted as war criminals. Wow, it just ramped up real quick. Now, again, to me, I chuckle because what's stupidity? But the term terrorist has a meaning. And what do we do with terrorists? We don't shake their hands. We don't negotiate with them. We killed them. Didn't Joe Biden just get on national TV and brag about firing a Hellfire missile that gave the Jinsu knife treatment to Ayman Zawahiri, a 71-year-old retired terrorist? So what you're doing when you do this is you're basically putting a target on the back of everybody on that list, and you're saying they're information terrorists. These are the equivalent of war criminals. And hey, vigilante justice, guys, go forth. Now, again, I don't live my life in fear, but maybe some people should, because Ukraine does have a history of taking blacklists and turning them into kill lists. They had a blacklist that came out in 2014, 2015 that had names of opposition politicians on there who were murdered, names of journalists who were murdered, names of other people who were deemed to be enemies of the state and who were arrested and tortured and disappeared. So this isn't a hypothetical. We're dealing with one of the worst nations on the planet, a corrupt criminal regime whose hero is Stepan Bandera, a mass murderer. And so therefore, when they say not just that you're a Russian propagandist, but that because you're a Russian propagandist, you're now an information terrorist who deserves to be treated like a war criminal, it's not something to be taken lightly. More so because the people doing this, assembling this list, are paid by the U.S. government with my taxpayer dollars. But now it gets even worse. The taxpayer dollars in question come from that $40 billion aid package that Joe Biden pushed through Congress back in May. The aid package that one senator had the courage to stand up and say, whoa, before we start throwing $40 billion towards the most corrupt regime in Europe, don't we want to have an inspector general that will tell us how this money is being spent, what's going on? And people say, well, you don't need to do that. CBS News just pulled because of pressure. They produced a documentary that says 70% of the weapons we send to Ukraine don't make it to the battlefield. Where do they go? The implication is there's massive corruption. But geez, an inspector general might be a useful thing to have, so we can track this sort of thing. But
fine, thanks to God for that. Now Rand Paul's on the list of
This is my point. Rand Paul, a United States senator who was doing his job as a senator, who talked about not just appropriating money, but managing that money, making sure that it's used properly, sort of the duty and responsibility of congressional oversight, was labeled by Chuck Schumer, my senator, as Putin's mouthpiece, the Senate Majority Leader. The Senate Majority Leader ramrodded this bill through, became a law, public law 117-128. Now, what's important about this, besides just being American political trivia, is that the Constitution of the United States, the First Amendment, prohibits Congress from passing laws or enacting legislation that abridge free speech. So what Chuck Schumer and company have done is pass a law that provides money to Ukraine to fund a Center for Disinformation that then targets American citizens, calling them information terrorists and war criminals for exercising free speech. Free speech. That's an end around the Constitution, which should be constitutional. Now, not only are they attacking me, they're attacking a U.S. senator for doing his job. But here's where it gets really interesting for old Chucky Poo. There's somebody else on that list, Diane Sayre. She's the LaRouche candidate challenging Chuck Schumer in the upcoming election. She's a politician challenging Chuck Schumer, and Chuck Schumer has gotten U.S. money to give to the Ukrainians, so they label her a candidate competing for his seat, an information terrorist. Wow, Chuck, you really think that's how American politics should be played? And people can say, well, Diane Sayre, she's a fringe candidate. No, New York actually tried to get rid of fringe candidates. They passed an election law that required anybody running for a seat to get 45,000 signatures before they could appear on the ballot. All of these old established fringe parties in New York, the Republican candidate tried to rally them, the Independent Party, the Conservative Family Party, none of them could meet that threshold. None of them could meet it. They aren't on the ballot. Diane Sayre got 66,000 signatures. She's on the ballot. So before somebody tries to dismiss her, understand that she's already passed a hurdle that none of the established fringe parties could do. She's on the ballot. I'm not saying she's going to beat Chuck, but she should beat Chuck because Diane Sayre actually believes in the Constitution, believes in the rights afforded to American citizens under the Constitution. Chuck Schumer believes it's okay to use U.S. taxpayer dollars to fund a disinformation center. It's an adjunct of the most corrupt president, of the most corrupt government, of the most corrupt nation in Europe to attack Americans for exercising their free speech rights. So no, this is a very serious story. Now, I've written letters to Chuck Schumer. I've written letters to Gillibrand, the other senator. I've written letters to Paul Tonko, my representative, appraising them of my concern. And they have until August 21st to respond, or at least take action in accordance to this. If they fail to do so, maybe something has to happen. I don't know. Maybe an injunction has to be filed in federal court demanding that this money be frozen to Ukraine until it can be proven that it's not being used to run an end around the Constitution. That's sort of the kind of thing a federal court might actually sit up and pay attention to. So, hey, Chuck, I'm coming for you. I don't know if he's watching your show, but I want to give him a little bit of indigestion.
I'll catch the replay later. It's an outrage, Scott. It's an absolute outrage.
It is.
As Americans, we have the right to speak our minds. We have that First Amendment, and we should be demanding and shouting it from the rooftops that we want every American citizen's name taken off that list.
Well, everybody's name should be taken off that list, but especially Americans. Here's the other thing. They call me a Russian propagandist, but this Center for Disinformation could only find three things to accuse me of. The three biggest crimes that make me a Russian propagandist. Crime number one, for having the gall to say that NATO has placed bases on Ukrainian soil. When there are press releases from NATO bragging about the bases that they have placed on Ukrainian soil. So I'm simply stating a fact that the United States and NATO put permanent training centers in Ukraine from 2015 up until 2022, where they trained tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers to NATO standards. It's trained them to go off, by the way, to Eastern Ukraine to fight and kill Russians. We brag about that, the United States does, in PowerPoint presentations and public affairs. But all I did is report the truth that came from the United States. But I'm a Russian propagandist for daring to highlight that fact. Number two, that I dare challenge the narrative of Bucha, the Bucha massacre. That I continue to say that all available data points to the inescapable reality that the people that were on the ground there dead were killed by Ukrainian security services. I have an open challenge to anybody in Ukraine, hell, anybody in the United States government, to have a debate about this. I'll do it anytime, any place you want to. Mano a mano, mano a womano, whoever you want to bring up against it. Bring the whole panel of people. Bring the whole Center for Disinformation. Bring them all. I'll travel to Ukraine to do this thing. We'll do it live on TV, and I will eviscerate them because I have all the facts. They can't respond to it. They got nothing. They literally have nothing. And yet I'm a propagandist for doing the job that mainstream journalism should be doing but refuses to do. Then the last thing was, I dare say that the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia is really a proxy war between NATO and Russia. But you know who else said that? You know, that known Russian hater, Max Boot, writes for the Washington Post. He wrote an op-ed in July that said, "This is our war too." Well, isn't Max Boot therefore a Russian propagandist? And what about Lloyd Austin, you know, the Secretary of Defense? Didn't he in May stand up in front of the TV cameras and tell the world that the American goal in Ukraine is to use the Ukrainian army to bleed the Russians, to inflict so much pain on Russia that they can never again undertake this kind of action? Isn't that literally the definition of proxy war? Of course it is. So I'm a Russian propagandist for telling the truth. And you know what?
Pointing out the obvious.
Yeah, so I'll take that. If that's what a Russian propagandist is, I own it, baby. I own it. You can label me that. You want to call me an information terrorist? Now you got another thing coming. And
you know,
so I won't tolerate it.
If you were Russia's biggest cheerleader, that's your right. If that's your opinion, you should be able to express it. If people want to call it propaganda, it's fine. But this is an end run around the United States Constitution. You are absolutely correct.
Yeah,
and
but
I have so many questions.
You know who else has a right? Well, you know who else has a right of free speech? The KKK. And we defend it, but we don't have to, give any credibility to the KKK. One of the reasons why I don't want to just say, well, I have a right to say whatever I want, no matter what, is that I create the possibility of false equivalency to say, well, yeah, but the KKK has the same right, but we shouldn't have to pay any attention to them. Hey, guys, I've been right on this issue more than I've been wrong by a big margin. I'm not somebody who's just out there making stuff up. When I open my mouth on Ukraine, it's usually because I put a lot of thought into it, a lot of research into it. I've applied professional skills that I've honed over decades, personal experiences. So when I speak, it hopefully is fact-based and based upon sound analysis. It's a solid track record. It cannot be allowed to be dismissed with a label Russian propagandist. I'm a hell of a good analyst. That's what people should be following, not a Russian propagandist.
Well, that's why we wanted to hear. And, we didn't have the First Amendment's there to protect controversial or unpopular speech. It's not there so we can talk about the weather.
That's right. You're 100% correct. And if
Listen,
it was,
I don't want to dominate this interview. I want Rick to get some questions in. I have so many that I could just keep you here all night. So I'm going to let Rick fire off a couple here.
No, this is awesome. That's why I'm glad you're here. But I will ask you this. You talked a little bit about all the money and the weapons and 70% of that aid not making it to the front line, which we talked about the other night. But is part of the reason those weapons are not making it there is because they're being intercepted or destroyed, or what do you make of that?
Well, I haven't seen the CBS documentary because they won't publish it because they've been placed under pressure.
I got to see it real quick, then like on Sunday night, and then I tried to send Rick the link so we could play it the next day on the show. It was gone. Yeah,
gone, finished.
Yeah, if you didn't
But
see it Sunday night,
think,
you don't get to see it, I guess.
I think the notion, for instance, the United States sent 108 M777 howitzers. I don't believe that 70 of those were siphoned off and sold on the black market. So I think when we speak of Javelin missiles, we speak of Stinger missiles, we speak of other weapons of this nature, the Switchblade autonomous drone. A lot of these are appearing on the black market. A lot of aid, and remember when we talk about $40 billion, only a fraction of that, around 8, 9, and still a lot of money. 8, 9 billion is actual military equipment. The rest of it is money, and that money's just disappearing. It's going into pockets. It's gone because Ukraine is the most corrupt nation in Europe. But I think the 70% number incorporates. And again, I say this without knowing this for sure because I haven't had the chance to see the documentary, so I don't know exactly what CBS, what parameters they used. But if I were to guess, I think it incorporates not just corruption, but the fact that Russia is destroying this stuff. That as soon as it enters into Ukraine, it's running a gauntlet that's increasingly dangerous. And then the other statistic that they should have followed up is of the 30% that makes it to the front line, what's its life expectancy? How long does it say? And there's a couple things that'll take it off the front line. Not just Russian action, and the Russians are very good at hunting this stuff down and killing it. But for instance, on the M777, and I wrote about this when that deal runs right there. I said this is not a good howitzer to be sending the Ukrainians because it's a high maintenance. It's a high maintenance date. You guys just got yourself a high maintenance date. A lot of care and feeding goes into this M777, and when you use it in a combat environment, firing a lot of rounds, it breaks all the time. And unless you have the spare parts and the people trained to repair it, you have a useless howitzer. And that's what's happening in Ukraine. Is they're complaining about this, saying we're bringing it to the front line, we're firing off some rounds, and then it breaks. We can't repair it. So now we got to take it back through the gauntlet to get repaired, and it's getting blown up. They're blowing up the ammunition. They're blowing up the support vehicles. They're blowing everything up. So I think when Biden signs off on these multi-billion-dollar deals or $700 million deals to send weapons to Ukraine, I think we need to understand that very little of that actually makes it to the front line, and once it gets to the front line, it doesn't have a long survival. The prospects are not good for this equipment, nor the Ukrainian soldiers operating. And here's the other important thing: Ukraine has sent. First of all, Ukraine has suffered horrific casualties. We have an insight into just how bad this is when there's documents that appear to be from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense that talk about 191,000 casualties, and that doesn't include Ukrainian border guards, which take the number up to close to 250,000. That's dead and wounded, but that's a lot of casualties. So they have a very reduced pool of experienced troops, trained troops. And these troops are the ones being pulled aside to be trained on this NATO equipment. They go to Germany, they go to Poland, they go elsewhere, and they receive training, and then they come back with this equipment. And when the equipment gets destroyed on the front line, it generally gets destroyed with troops attached, meaning that these are the elite troops that are being killed by the Russians. And even so, as we bring in new equipment, the Ukrainians no longer have the reservoir of troops capable of receiving this equipment. They have untrained, old men who can't use this equipment. So we're sending equipment to the Ukrainians that is not going to be used in an optimal fashion, which means it's going to be intercepted and killed by the Russians, killing more Ukrainians. So all this money and all this equipment we're sending to Ukrainians really does one thing and one thing only: kills more Ukrainians. We're responsible for the deaths of many of those 191,000 casualties that Ukraine apparently has suffered.
So Canada is joining this effort. There's some feedback coming in to send more personnel to train more Ukrainian soldiers. I think what are they talking about? Something like 10,000 a month. They're hoping to train, but and they're doing this. I think the Canadian personnel is going to UK to do it. Is it even worthwhile? Is the training adequate? Can they do this in that amount of time and get them to the front lines?
Well, the Canadians and the Brits and the Americans, and I guess the Danes are doing this. Everybody's jumping on the training the bandwagon. Let's start off by just pointing out an unfortunate truism from history. When was the last time NATO trained an army that won? Never. NATO can't train an army that wins. NATO trained the Afghan army. It lost. Trained the Iraqi army. It's losing. They're training the Syrians. They're losing. I'm not the Syrian government, the Kurds. So right off the bat, we're talking about the fact that there's not a good track record in training people to fight conflicts. Two, the Canadians have no clue what they're training them for. When was the last time the Canadians fought the Russians in large-scale combat? Do the Canadians have any firsthand experience about what's going on the battlefield? They don't. They don't know what it's like to operate. The Canadians will be bringing in Canadian doctrine. They'll adapt the doctrine to meet the training standard of the troops being trained, which will probably be a little bit lower than the Canadian standard. But it's a doctrine that's based upon a NATO way of waging war with NATO presumptions that don't include getting pounded by 60,000 artillery rounds a day. If the Canadians would listen to what the Ukrainians are saying, the Ukrainian soldiers are making these videos. They're sitting back home saying, we go to the front line and we're ready to fight the Russians, but next thing we know, our battalion suffered 50, 60% casualties and we're pulled away and we never saw a Russian. So we go to the front line, we die, we retreat, we never saw a Russian. Hey, Canada, how do you train troops to fight in that? Give them more artillery? Well, you tried that. The Russians are blowing it up. They're blowing up the ammunition. This isn't going to do anything other than get more Ukrainians killed.